Today, we are digging into a massive question, one that sits at the intersection of faith, history, and archaeology. We're asking, what happens when you read the Bible not just as a spiritual guide, but as a historical record? What does the actual physical evidence have to say?
For countless people, it's a sacred text, right? The ultimate book of faith. But if you're a historian or an archaeologist, you have a totally different question. Can you test these stories? Did the Great Flood, the patriarchs, the ancient kingdoms, did they leave any fingerprints on the physical world? Well, that's exactly what we're going to investigate.
So, here's our game plan. First, we'll talk about how you even look for history in a holy book. Then, we're diving into 3 big case studies: the story of a great flood, the time of the patriarchs, and the era of Israel's first kings. And finally, we'll pull it all together and see what it all means. All right, let's get into it. How on earth do you begin to find verifiable history in a text that's fundamentally about faith? The answer is you have to find where the story meets the soil. You see, you've got to remember that ancient texts like the Bible weren't written like our modern history books. They're a blend of everything: theology, cultural memory, historical accounts. So for researchers, the challenge is to be a kind of detective, using every tool they have, from literary analysis to geology, to find those moments of overlap, those places where the text and the physical evidence line up. Let's start with maybe the most epic story of all, a great world-destroying flood. Is it just a myth, or is it a distant memory of a real catastrophic event? Okay, what's amazing is that the Genesis story isn't some outlier. The entire ancient world, especially Mesopotamia, was buzzing with stories about a great flood. You have the famous Epic of Gilgamesh, but also others, like the Atrahasis epic. Some texts even divide all of history into before the flood and after the flood. I mean, the similarities are just undeniable, which suggests that all these cultures were drawing from a shared, deep-seated memory of some kind of disaster. So how can we possibly test that memory? Well, one of the most important tools is something called stratigraphy. Just think of the ground beneath your feet as a giant history book. As archaeologists dig down, they go through different layers, or strata. And the deeper you go, the older the layer is. It's a physical timeline of everything that happened in that one spot.
And this is where it gets really cool. In that very same region, the Tigris-Euphrates basin where all these flood stories came from, archaeologists started digging. And what did they find? They found exactly what the stories describe: massive, thick layers of silt, the kind only left behind by a massive flood. And this silt layer violently interrupted the layers of human settlement. The story literally meets the soil.
All right, now we're going to zoom in. From a potentially global disaster down to the story of a single family, the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, for a long time, the common wisdom among many scholars, the so-called historical minimalists, was that these stories were basically historical fiction. The idea was that they were written down maybe 1,000 years after they supposedly happened, created to give a young nation a cool origin story. But then, well, the digging kept going, and as this quote explains, a whole wave of new discoveries started to poke holes in that theory. In fact, it systematically dismantled that skepticism. The evidence began to pile up, showing that these stories were way more authentic to their claimed time period than anyone had thought. Just take a look at Abraham's migration. When you actually trace it on a map, it's not some random wandering in the desert. The route described in Genesis, from Ur, north to Haran, then down into Canaan, it perfectly follows the major established trade routes of the Middle Bronze Age, right around 2000 BCE. The geography is spot on for the period. And it goes even deeper. Archaeologists have found thousands of ancient clay tablets from places like Mari and Nuzi, and these tablets describe legal customs that sound totally bizarre to us, but they perfectly match strange events in Genesis, like a man adopting his slave as an heir if he didn't have a son. Even the names like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were really common in that part of the world, specifically in that time period. Later on, they fall out of fashion. It's like finding a cultural fingerprint. And check this out. This is one of the most mind-blowing little details. The book of Genesis says Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery for 20 shekels of silver. Well, guess what? Legal texts and records we found from the 18th century BCE show that the standard market price for a slave was, you guessed it, exactly 20 shekels. Not 15, not 30, 20. The price is historically perfect. So the cultural background checks out in a big way. But what about actual people and places mentioned in the Bible? Let's jump ahead in time to the era of kings, warriors, and giants. Everybody knows the story of David and Goliath, right? The young shepherd versus the towering Philistine champion from the city of Gath. I mean, it sounds like pure legend, but what happens when archaeologists start digging in the real historical city of Gath? They found this, a little piece of a broken pot. But it is a huge discovery. Why? Because it dates to the exact time of King Saul and David, and it's inscribed with two names that are linguistically related to Goliath. Now, this isn't the giant's personal coffee mug, but it's slam dunk proof that names just like his were actually being used in his hometown at precisely the right moment in history.
But maybe the single most important piece of evidence of all wasn't found in Israel. It was found in Egypt. Back in 1896, archaeologists in Thebes uncovered this, a massive 10-foot-tall granite slab, a victory monument for the pharaoh Merneptah.
And carved into that stone, among a list of all the peoples the pharaoh claimed to have conquered, is this unbelievable line from around 1208 BCE. Israel is laid waste, his seed is not. This right here is the earliest known non-biblical reference to a group of people called Israel, and it places them in the land of Canaan at this exact time. It's history, etched in stone. Okay, so we've got flood layers, ancient customs, trade routes, personal names, even a pharaoh's victory monument. Let's take a breath and ask, what does this all add up to? Now, it's really important to be precise here. Does this prove the Bible is true like you'd prove a math equation? No, archaeology almost never gives you that kind of absolute certainty. But what it does provide is something just as important: powerful, consistent corroboration. It shows that these biblical stories aren't happening in some mythical, once-upon-a-time fantasy land. When you lay it all out, the pattern is just undeniable. You've got textual parallels like the flood myths, pointing to a shared memory. You've got cultural and legal customs on ancient tablets that perfectly match the patriarchal traditions. You have geopolitical accuracy in the maps and trade routes. You have linguistic evidence in the names people used. And on top of all that, you have direct physical artifacts mentioning biblical names and places. So the verdict from the ground, from the dirt and the stone, is this. The Bible is a document that is authentically and deeply rooted in the real history, the real geography, and the real culture of the ancient world it talks about. The stage where these incredible stories take place, it was a real place. And that leaves us with one final big question to think about. Knowing that these ancient narratives are so firmly anchored in a verifiable physical reality, how does that change the way we read and understand these powerful stories today?